intro, and then I'll hand it off to you. All right.
Gotcha.
All right. So yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today to celebrate Ramnavami. Our event is part of a series of Ramnavami celebrations that we're doing from all the Hindu YUVA chapters in the Northeast region, as you guys saw in the flyer. So make sure to check out all the other ones as well. So today we're having a discussion on Hanuman, and they'll be given by Sushruth Pattekar. And I'll just give a quick bio or intro of Sushruth ji before we start. So Sushruth was raised in Peoria, Illinois, and he attended the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he graduated with a bachelor's in political science in 2018. He simultaneously commissioned as an active duty Army officer through the ROTC program. After further training at Fort Benning, Georgia, Sushruth is currently stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where he is assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. He spent his time there as a platoon leader and air operations officer, and is even deployed to the Middle East. So with that, Sushruth ji, you can go ahead.
Hey guys, good evening. So today's gonna be session's gonna be a little different, right? As you know, the topic is Hanuman. However, most of us know most of the stories of Hanuman growing up, right? From a young age, it's kind of ingrained in most of us, whether it's through our parents' stories, Bal Vihar, Bal Gokulam, Shaka, etc., whatever, right? So the topic of this session, what I was asked to present on, was Hanuman specifically as a warrior, right? Or the ideal soldier. So when we think of Hanuman, right, one of those key aspects we think of Hanuman is Hanuman the warrior, right? His biggest role probably in our collective, knowledge of him is one of Lord Ram's primary commanders during the invasion of Lanka, right, and Ramayan itself. His whole identity in our imagination kind of stems from his relationship with Ram, specifically during the events of the Ramayan. So we're going to kind of go through, I'm going to look at different aspects of Hanumanji's life, or his attributes, and how they relate to him being the warrior, right? So to start, sorry, that's a little chaos going on in the background. So one of the primary aspects of Hanuman is Hanuman the Brahmachari, right? As a Brahmachari, he is the epitome of self-control and discipline. So the bedrock of any kind of military proficiency, warrior proficiency, skill is discipline. I'm not talking about his discipline as in how much you can march, how you can stand straight. Discipline as in the ability to push through pain, endure, and accomplish the mission or get stronger, right? It's kind of the bedrock. In order to become strong, in order to become intelligent, in order to become a better warrior, right, you have to have that discipline. You can't, right? So physical fitness, right? Even starting from physical fitness. If you don't have the bedrock of discipline, you don't have the ability to get up every day, right? Improve yourself physically. Everybody talks about motivation, right? And everyone's looking for motivation. We look for motivational quotes, posters, but when you're tired, when you're hungry, when life isn't going your way, motivation really doesn't matter, right? It's not there for you. The only thing driving you through those hard times is your ability to have self-control and to push through just based on discipline, right? And that's just not physical, right? Physical pain, but also emotional pain, right? Emotional pain, emotional hardship. Going on to the next, next aspect, big aspect of Hanuman, right? Probably the one we think of most is strength. From gymkhanas of India, right, to the Muay Thai ring in Thailand. Hanuman is seen everywhere in imagery. Traditionally, for example, right, traditionally, Muay Thai boxers, which is Thai kickboxing, they get tattoos of Hanuman, right? He is before every match, they pray to Hanuman. It's part of the ritual of Muay Thai kickboxing matches. And then, as we know, like the Pehlwans of India, right? Every gym, every Pehlwan gym in India, has have shrine to Hanuman. And the benefits of strength, pretty on the surface, they're pretty, self-explanatory, right? Especially in the martial areas. Strength is the tool. Everything is kind of based on strength, right? You can't impose your will. You can't commit any action without having the strength to do so. However, right, think about this as a Hindu community. We have all these idols of strength, right? We grew up with the stories of Hanuman, Bhim, Bhishma. More recently, you have Shivaji Maharaj, Maharana Pratap. You have all these martial role models. We tell our kids, wow, man, like Hanuman was so strong. He lifted an entire mountain, took it back to Lanka. Bhim was such a strong guy. All these warriors, right? Who had the ability to commit great feats because of their strength. However, we don't instill this within our community, right? Even though we talk about strength, these great feats for our kids, right? Within our community, you're intelligent, you're doing good in school, right? You get a good job, that's all that matters, right? Strength, physical fitness, physical ability takes a backseat, right? But ultimately, the thing is here, you can have everything in the world, right? You can have the intelligence, you can have the success or the financial success, the samskars, etc. But ultimately, without strength, without the ability to endure, without the ability to protect yourself, or your community, none of that ultimately matters, right? And we see that in the history of Bharat, right? We can talk all you want about how wealthy India once was, how the extraordinary culture, the scientific advancements we made way before many other cultures. But ultimately, if you're not, to colloquial, put in vernacular, if you're not hard enough, someone who's harder than you, doesn't matter what their values are, right? How righteous they are, how non-righteous they are. If they're harder than you, they're going to come through and they're going to destroy everything that you've built up, right? Ultimately, none of that matters if you don't have the ability to resist. And we see this throughout, the history of Bharat, history of, or recently history of India. So that's a big aspect, especially Hanuman, that as a community we really need to shift our focus to. So moving on, another thing is, probably the second most important value we kind of associate with Hanuman is his incredible bhakti, right? Especially to Lord Ram. Everybody knows the story of Hanuman ripping open his chest and revealing Ram, Sita to the court of Rama, right? How does this translate to Hanuman as the ultimate warrior, the ultimate soldier? So people join the military for a number of reasons, right? When we think of it, first thing that comes to our head for people's motivation to join is, quote unquote, queen and country, right? Devotion to the nation, serving the country. However, there's quite a bit of diversity of why people join the military. Whether that's, getting college, being able to pay for college, making out of your circumstances, whether that's, reservation, North Dakota, coal country in West Virginia, West Baltimore. It's just a way to get out. For others, it's a chance of adventure and travel, do something. There's quite the variety, and frankly, probably most people who enlist in the military have, a variety of those reasons to join. However, those ultimately that doesn't matter, right? The Army, for example, the Army doesn't care why you join the Army. Me as a platoon leader, right? I don't care why my soldiers join. What matters in the end is, can they perform? Can they shoot? Can they fight? Are they physically fit? And most importantly, can they devote themselves completely and selflessly to their fellow brother or sister, right? That is the ultimate form of bhakti for a soldier. When you're deployed, right, in a combat situation or hardship or whatever, you're not thinking about country or religion or nationalism, whatever ideal. You're doing everything for the guy on your right, guy on your left, whoever you're responsible for, right? And that kind of bond, that kind of bhakti to each other, devotion, is one of the strongest bonds, strongest forms of bhakti that you will ever see, right? And ultimately, devoting yourself to your fellow brother, your sister, that's directly connecting to Bhagwan, right? Because as humans, we are all manifestations of Bhagwan. So that's an important aspect, because in the end, that's all that matters, right? The best soldiers, the best leaders are the ones who genuinely care and devote themselves to their soldiers and to their brothers and sisters, right? And that's what bhakti is. Kind of, going another aspect, right? So Hanuman is said to be immortal. He's eternal, right? We see him pop up throughout different ithihas. Obviously he's prominent in Ramayan, but then, a few thousand years afterwards, he pops up in the Mahabharata again, right? There's the story of, in order to teach Bhim humility, Hanuman disguising himself, laying in his path, and asking Bhim to lift his tail. And throughout he pops up again and again. A warrior, right? Throughout history, one thing that's been consistent since the dawn of man is the necessity for there to be people who commit violence on behalf of their community, right? And this isn't limited to the human race, even within the animal kingdom. It doesn't matter, in order for there to be peace, both parties involved in the process, have to agree to that process, right? You can commit to peace all you want. However, if the other party doesn't care, then unless you have the means to defend yourself, the means to have warriors, then you're not going to survive as a community, or you're going to lose. And just like Hanuman is eternal, right? The need for warriors is eternal as well, right? And that's not necessarily just physical, right? Physical violence, even intellectually, right? The biggest, at least for us in the West, currently the biggest danger or struggle for the Hindu community here is more of an intellectual war, right? Combating misrepresentation in media, academia, etc. And then, looking at it historically too, right? So Hanuman's been a symbol. He's popped up as a symbol throughout history for martial prowess. From everything from the Mahabharata, right? Arjun's chariot, Hanuman, manifested as being on the flag on his chariot, right? And then, going on into like the late Middle Ages, Hanuman was one of the inspirations for the Khalsa movement, right? Many of the Sikh regiments of the Sikh Empire would have Hanuman on, their battle standards. And then, more modern examples, the traditions, martial arts traditions of South and Southeast Asia, hold Hanuman as a patron, because he is the ultimate warrior monk, right? Because Hanuman, not only is he a warrior, not only is he strong, but he's an intellectual, right? And so much of military prowess has to do with having intelligence, right? And knowing your enemy, knowing the culture you're operating in, knowing everything you can about the environment, tactics, whatever, right? And then one of the biggest, another example I kind of missed earlier was the influence of Hanuman in resistance against foreign Islamic rule in the 17th century, right? Specifically in Maharashtra. The development of the rise of the prominence of the Marathas in the 1600s. He was an important symbol back then. So all of this, all of this attests to Hanuman's importance, right? His character as the ultimate soldier or warrior, right? But what's ultimately more important is how we're taking this into account and applying it to our lives, right? Kind of going back to my earlier point, we have a lot of these martial figures and characters in our history, in our stories, but we don't really do them the justice. It's a lot of lip service, right? We don't embody those aspects, that culture, that martial prowess. And that doesn't necessarily mean, we need to go, all Hindus should go enlist in the military, right? Or join the law enforcement or something. This is everything from our day-to-day lives, right? Because as humans, we talk about Vasudeva Kutumbakam, right? Whole world is our family. But part of your dharma as a family member is you are obligated, right? You are obligated to protect your fellow human beings, right? Your family, your community, or anybody in the world, right? Because the whole world, is family. And because of that, it is also our obligation to be best prepared to deal with the situation where we have to protect someone, right? You never want to be somewhere where you see somebody getting harmed and you aren't able to do your duty of helping them or protecting them because you're too weak, right? So I think that's kind of the ultimate lesson coming out of here. So that's kind of the first little brief overview of Hanuman as the ideal warrior, right? So what I'm doing now is kind of opening it up to discussion, right? So if there's any questions, or you want to counter a point I made, or even have your own comments on any of these aspects, I'm gonna leave the floor open to that.
Okay, guys. So like Sushruth said, the chat is open. So if you guys have questions, comments, anything he said, just drop it in the chat and then we'll address it here. So until then, until you guys are coming up with things to ask him, I'll just kind of begin and ask Sushruth a few questions about Hanuman. So I guess to begin with, you were talking about a lot about we need warriors in your talk. So maybe I missed this, but like, what do you like? Do you have like a good definition of like what warrior means to you, like either today, like physically, anyway? Like, how would you define warrior?
Okay. So and there's kind of two ways you can look at this, right? So one, you have in the literal sense, right? In the literal sense, a warrior is someone who dedicates themselves in their profession, right? To it sounds crude, but essentially it's what it is, right? That you're in a profession dedicated to committing violence on behalf of whether it's the state, whether it's your community, or any kind of group, right? That's kind of the literal sense of the definition. And kind of the other way to look at it is in the sense of, you're still in the arena, right? Like you're still that man or woman in the arena, but that battleground doesn't necessarily have to be, a literal battlefield, right? Yes, we can talk about, the intellectual battlefield, right? The example I gave, but I think what we still need to go back to is that even that's not exactly the whole thing there, right? Even if you have the means, the ability, to succeed on the intellectual battlefield, if you don't have the physical means, right? If you're not physically prepared for that as a human being, to resist, to be survivable, right? Then you're not truly a warrior, right? It's a holistic aspect, and it goes both ways, even on the literal sense, right? As a soldier, right? Say the most modern sense of a warrior is a soldier fighting for the state. Yes, physical strength and the ability to endure, commit violence, that's important, but also intellectual prowess, right? Being able to learn new tactics to adapt, etc. That's very important too. You're not a good warrior unless you have that intellectual capacity as well. And it goes the other way too. In the sense of, I'll say a civilian, for example, right? Even though the focus here might be on the intellectual side, the non-literal battlefield, if you're not physically capable of withstanding physical violence or even being healthy, right? Then you're not abiding by that either. Kind of a good way to put this physically, right, is that you can't, when you're weak, right? If you're suffering physically or if you're hobbled physically, you can't maximize how much you can commit to intellectual pursuits, right? Because you're too worried about fixing your health, right? You might be dependent on others. And especially as you get older, right? That's kind of the irony of this. As you get older, you develop that intellectual experience, that knowledge, etc., to give other people. But simultaneously, it becomes harder to survive, right? You become weaker, especially if you don't work at it. So especially as we get older, it's important to keep that warrior mentality and prepare our body as much as we can in order to be able to succeed on the intellectual front, as to say. Kind of long-winded, but
Yeah, for sure. So basically, like being physically fit is like important regardless of if you're like an actual soldier, civilian, whatever. That's still an important part, right, to being a warrior.
yes, yeah. I remember on another discussion I was having, right? We were talking about, different forms of physical fitness, right? Specifically, weightlifting, right? And this individual was like, hey, I work an office job, right? Computer, I'm a computer programmer, right? So I don't need to be lifting like heavy weights, right? I'm not too worried about being physically fit like that, right? But that's not an excuse, right? Because going back to the concept of your dharma, right? Because as a citizen, as a human being, you owe the person on your right and left, right? Your fellow community members, your fellow humans, to be in the best possible shape, to aid them if they're hurt or if they're in danger, right? So no matter what our profession, what our station in life, that's always an important aspect.
All right. So one question we got from the chat, I got in a direct message. So did you ever feel like Hanuman was with you at your time in training or challenges? And like, how can we take Hanuman with us in a sense?
All right. So in the literal sense, no, right? I'm so personally me, I'm not very, I don't actively, for example, I don't actively pray a lot. Kind of my personal form of devotion, right, is, I relate to karma yoga, right, through actions. So my worship of Hanuman is through being the best possible shape, right? Is through succeeding in my duties, my preparation of being, a military officer, a soldier. So that was kind of my inspiration. In the literal sense, yeah, you could say so. I mean, I have a tattoo of Hanuman, right, in the literal sense. And then what we can take is, it all goes back to being that well-rounded warrior, right? That's kind of what differentiates Hanuman from a lot of other characters in our Itihas, figures. You have Bhim, for example, who's known, extremely strong guy, right? But he's not really known for his intelligence or his tact. Likewise, you have a lot of these other like martial characters who are kind of just known for their brute strength or their actual prowess. But Hanuman is kind of the ultimate warrior here, right? Because in addition to being incredibly strong, powerful, a great leader too, right? That's something else I didn't mention, is that when during the battle for Lanka to get Sita, right? Now, Hanuman was one of the commanders of this army. So he was a great military leader as well. But he was also a prominent, he was a yogi, he was an intellectual, he was creative. And you can't succeed not only as, a soldier or warrior without being well-rounded like that, but kind of going back to being a human being in general, right? So he's kind of the pinnacle of being like the all-rounded individual, the jack of all trades, as they say.
So we have a few more questions in the chat. So here's one. So is there something that keeps you balanced, from your own experience on the ground, like in the middle of adversity, basically to be balanced through your karma yoga, essentially?
Could you repeat the question? I missed the second half of it.
Yeah, sure. It's in the chat as well. So maybe if you want to read that. But he's asking, wonder if there's something that keeps you balanced from your own personal experience on the ground in the middle of adversity to be balanced through your karma yoga, essentially.
Yeah. So this is something, right? Very important, right? So one of the great things about Hindu Dharma, right, which I really discovered the last couple of years, is that the philosophy really meshes well with for someone in the armed profession, right? And not only with kind of like the overall aspect of it, but I'm talking about specific experiences that you may encounter in this profession, and dealing with it, right? So, for example, going back to the Mahabharata, right? The Gita specifically, right? We all know about the discussion on the middle of the battlefield, Arjun's confliction of, having to kill his family members in the bloodbath that would be to come. And for a professional soldier, right, that's that concept of that being his duty, right? It was his duty to fight as a Kshatriya, right? That keeps people grounded, right? And especially for me, right? Because ultimately, as a soldier, and specifically as a combat arms soldier, right? My job, my duty ultimately goes to, committing violence, right? On behalf of, the US, the people of the United States, all enemies, foreign and domestic, right? We swear our allegiance to the Constitution. And that's ultimately what it is. It's my dharma to do whatever I do, right? And then the other thing is, the concept of detachment. So this isn't very, not necessarily Hanuman centric, but kind of branching out into Hindu philosophy is, when you go to a combat zone, right, or even not even combat zone, right, you might go, a lot of missions the military does is some kind of humanitarian aid, right? Like Haiti is a big example. You do these missions and you see a lot of things that are pretty jarring, right? And in the kind of the Western tradition, right, the Judeo-Abrahamic tradition, there's a big importance on the human body, and the person and the body kind of being part of the same thing, the same concept, right? And because of that, because of our philosophy of disassociating those two things, and the values of detachment, in a lot of difficult situations where you see see things like this, right, which we wouldn't see over here, right? It's easier to kind of push through, right? Not ignore, that's not the same thing, but acknowledge and continue to do your job, right? And kind of disassociating yourself with, or not letting it affect you negatively, right? So on the emotional side, it's a very practical philosophy.
So, all right, next question we have from Narasimhaji. So how do you characterize the Sanjeevani accomplishment?
Okay. So, I mean, that one kind of, that one goes back to kind of like a lot of the earlier points I was making. Going back to strength ultimately, right? And I can hit a dead horse on this one. But I think, that's so. This might be a question for someone else, actually, right? Because for me personally, these very these massive feats, right? These like crazy, like legendary feats of strength, etc. Actions. It's a little harder to, associate with or find inspiration from that. To be frank, right? And that's just
If I may,
yeah.
Yeah, just the way I see it is to make sure the job is done, no matter what. See, he got doubt, which is Sanjeevani, this or that. So he didn't want to fail. So he want to make sure he gets the Sanjeevani to Lakshman. So meeting the goal. So he thought that's the best. So it's a foolproof way to get that done. That's the way I take it as the qualities of Hanuman. So never fail. So do whatever you can. You get, Lord Rama gave the Agnya to go there. So he has to accomplish. So he didn't just come back saying, oh, I couldn't find. So he thought, what the heck, just lift everything and take so that there's no chance of failure. So that's what I would take.
That's a very good point. That has definitely opened my eyes to that whole aspect of it, because that concept is so central to the military profession, right? Where your commander, your platoon leader, whoever says, hey, you're given a task, you're given a condition, and I don't care, this just needs to happen, right? There's a kind of famous publication. So it's a small novella called Letter from Garcia, right? And it's mandatory reading in the Marine Corps. And essentially, it's from the Spanish-American War about soldiers given the task of hey, this message, this dispatch needs to go to this commander, right? It takes place in Cuba in the early 1900s, and the ultimate lesson behind the novella, the story, is that this guy's given a task, right? He's given, hey, this letter needs to get to this officer. I don't care how you do it. It just needs to happen, right? And it's this guy is characterized because he doesn't ask too many questions, right? He doesn't go back and he's like, okay, I can't do this, or it's too rough. Can you help me out with this? Or, can I get these resources, etc. He kind of takes his own initiative, figures out how to do it, and then accomplishes it. So that's a very good point. I didn't think about that.
Right. Yeah, the similar one, go to Ashok one, right? If he goes to Ashok one, his task was to just find Sita and come back where she is. So the one thing I take from that is he does more than what he asked. He just say, a lot of in the real world, people, okay, somebody gives a task, we barely accomplish the task. Oh, okay, that's it. I don't need to do anything else. But Hanuman doesn't stop there. He wants to test the strength. He wants to scout. He did a recon, where the strength, and he did a lot more things. So once he comes back, he will be easy to accomplish. That's one thing I always see in Hanuman's story. It's doing more than what you have given task. Not only accomplish one perfectly, and added value, we call it in the modern world, right? So that's kind of a statement. I think it appears in that story for me.
For sure, definitely agree.
Cool. Yeah, that was definitely great discussion. And yeah, everyone else, if you have some extra thoughts that you want to say, you can just feel free to unmute and talk to Sushruth as well. So next question we have from Neha. Was there a time in combat that made you think of Hanuman?
So this kind of goes to like one of the points I was making earlier, right? So no, like that's in movies, right? A lot of times in like movies and media, there's always some kind of agenda, right? Especially in war movies. Unfortunately, war movies tend to be very politicized, whether they're anti-war movies, right, or they're the opposite, like the gung-ho, red, white, and blue, American Sniper, etc. And then a lot of these movies, even in combat scenes, you have a lot of this like commentary being made, whether it's social commentary, political commentary, etc. Or in some cases, you're thinking about God and country, right? But the thing is, like in a combat situation, right, there's two things you're running off of, which is muscle memory and the training and adrenaline. And then the only real non-tangible thing involved is your dedication, like going back, the bhakti you have for your fellow soldiers. So in the literal sense, no. When bullets are flying, there's not a lot of non-tangible things going on when that stuff happens. There's actually I remember a couple of years ago, there's like a series of skits that were getting circulated on Facebook on is like two Jawans, like Indian Jawans, they'd be like firing at the enemy, and then they'd be having some kind of deep discussion on nationalism at the same time, which always made me laugh. Yeah, not ever in actual kinetic situation.
Earlier, you also had mentioned for Hinduism, there's a lot of misrepresentation in the media and by others. So what are some things that we could do to clear that up?
Oh man, so that's a whole nother series of discussion series on its own. So I can bring it down to like a small level, right? My experience in the military. So in the military, right, there are not a lot of Hindus at all. Because of that, a lot of times the discussion doesn't even happen. Like people don't realize that you're a Hindu, or even if you're South Asian, right? Kind of assume you're from another culture. But the discussions I've had have been pretty profound, because people are pretty curious, right? That's something cool about the military, is it's one of the few institutions, or probably the sole institution in the United States, where you have people from completely different religious, ethnic, socioeconomic, physical backgrounds being forced into work together 24/7, right? And it leads to some very interesting discussions, change of viewpoints, etc. So I always have I always find the opportunity to talk about that if somebody asks. And the biggest thing for me I found is to not preach, right? Or become immediately defensive, because a lot of times, like the ignorance, we see this ignorance is often literally just that, right? Ignorance. It doesn't come from a place of malice or hate. And a lot of times we tend to close ourselves in, we get defensive during these discussions. And that doesn't really contribute, right? That doesn't help us, because you see right through it, right? The other person automatically becomes defensive as well. So my suggestion for any kind of situation would be like where you are correcting, misconceptions or trying to clear ignorance, is to, keep it open. Try not to get defensive, and understand that a lot of this just comes from lack of knowledge, right? And generally, I found most people genuinely want to learn more. They want the knowledge, right? That very few people are going to be actively trying to, put you down or your beliefs down. And that's kind of reflection of the world as a whole, right? We see the highlights, we see well, not the highlights, we see the downlights. I don't know what the word would be of the world of people, right? We see the worst of people, but in reality, that's a pretty small portion of humanity.
So one question I had actually from hearing your discussion earlier is, like you were mentioning that we should try to incorporate Hanuman in our day-to-day lives. I was wondering, like, do you have any like practices that we can maybe do so that we can try to be more like Hanuman?
Go to the gym.
Go to the gym, yeah.
That's what I'm like, right? Your ultimate kind of devotion to Hanuman, at least in my viewpoint, is worshiping him through that action, right? It is not only going to the gym, but learning about your body, learning how the body works, learn how to get stronger. And just like Hanuman, you have to put your sacrifice involved and there's discipline involved, right? But I think to start with, that's something we all need to do, right? And that goes from people who don't work out to like, people work out regularly. Like I have those days where I'm like, man, wake up, do not want to get after it. But it's your duty. It's your dharma to be as physically fit as possible. It's a good goal to have. So it sounds a bit extreme, but it's a good way to work towards something. Is we always talk about, in the military, to become harder to kill, right? And that's not necessarily just like, hey, I'm in a dark alley, getting assaulted or on the battlefield. But I'm talking about health in general as you get older, right? The stronger you are when you're younger, the more resistance training you're doing, the more you're able to endure physically, the better your life is going to be physically as you get on in years, right? Everything from like arthritis, being able to play with your kids, right? Go on long walks, like well into your years, in order to have that longevity and to focus your things on the next stage of life, right? Whether that's bringing up the next generation, mentoring people intellectually. If you're not physically healthy, then you can't fully dedicate yourself to those other pursuits.
Yeah, that's definitely like a great way to what is it? Great way to like pray to Hanuman, I guess. But it's always like something that's hard. I know, at least even for me. Like I always say, like I want to go to the gym more, but it's hard to stay committed to that. So definitely need to put more focus on that aspect. And I think someone in the chat mentioned also, you can start chanting Hanuman Chalisa every day. So that's also definitely a great practice.
Sure.
Yeah. Let's see what else. So are there any more chat questions? You guys can also unmute if you want. We'll be going on for a little bit longer. We're almost near the end. But yeah, one other question I came up with was, in what ways, do you relate yourself to Hanuman? Are there any ways? I guess it's pretty similar to some of the stuff that you might have mentioned earlier, but.
My connection just like went off for a little bit. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I was just saying, like, in what ways do you relate yourself to Hanuman? You know, I know you said you obviously like are not like actively thinking about him on the battlefield or anything like that. But you know, are there any other ways you
Yeah.
relate to him?
You know, like for me, right? The biggest aspect is as a leader in the military, right? I talked about no earlier that as the profession of arms, right? The army or any armed profession, don't care why you join, right? It doesn't matter how altruistic your motivations are, how quote unquote selfless, or if you're literally there to as a stepping stone or pay for college, whatever, etc. Once you're in, right, the ultimate thing that matters and kind of the ultimate ruler, right, the measuring ruler for military leadership of any kind is how devoted you are to those you are responsible for, and devotion, right, which is one of those, one of the primary aspects of Hanuman, is the ultimate bhakti. If you do not have that for who you are responsible for as a leader in the military, then you aren't doing your job, right? And that's the standard I held myself to, and tried to hold myself to, and that was kind of my primary takeaway from Hanuman and why I look up to Hanuman, right? The strength, physical prowess aspect, the intellectual aspect, that's all there. But specifically for me and my profession, that is ultimately what I took from it.
So prior to joining the military, has your like admiration for Hinduism and like Hanuman and all that, did that like play a role in pushing you to be in the military, or has it been like once you've been in the military and like the situation you've been put through, you started gaining like another like aspect to like why you want to start why you want to look up to Hanuman more, like how you want to tie your life into his more?
Yeah. So I will say this. I will say definitely my time in the military opened my eyes to a lot of concepts from Hindu Dharma that like growing up they were preached. They're preached to you. I heard it in Balvihar, right? You hear it regurgitated, etc. But you're kind of tuning yourself out. You're like, yeah, I've heard this over and over again. But after kind of extreme circumstances you experience, right? You kind of see how it practically comes about. So I've already mentioned. The concepts of doing dharma, like your dharma on the battlefield as a soldier, not letting that affect your performance. And I've talked about detachment, the concept of detachment. But another aspect here, right, is so a lot of the modern conflicts, right, especially last couple ones, involve U.S. soldiers, U.S. Marines fighting halfway across the world, right, and where you're not directly fighting to protect American citizens, right? Like some infantrymen, working with village militia in the middle of Afghanistan. His actions aren't directly protecting, Americans, right? You can argue like through a chain of, a global world, keeping fighting, extremism out there, right? You're keeping it away, but in the direct sense, you're not doing that, right? So because of that, a lot of people kind of, one of the arguments against these kinds of missions sets is, what motivates you, right, to be, doing military operations other side of the world, right, in a place that has nothing to do with where your family's from, right, where your community is from. And then the biggest thing for me, right, biggest concept goes back to, Vasudeva Kutumbakam, right? I've heard so many times from people, right, that, why don't you we should just let them kill each other, right? Without kind of just like any kind of discussion regarding, extremism or conflict in the Middle East or Africa or whatever, right? And this aspect I'm talking about, I'm not debating like I don't mean arguments regarding like the practical aspect of it, or repercussions or second order effects from being involved in countries and other places, but I'm talking about specifically the idea of fighting across the world, right? And you really learn that everyone really is a lot more similar than we think, right? My time in the Middle East when I was deployed, right? A lot of our work had to do with kind of like training, mentoring the local security forces and militiamen who had to deal with fighting ISIS, Al Qaeda, et cetera, et cetera. And my sense of empathy definitely went up. And then you really see that concept that the whole world is your family, right? Everyone's a lot more similar than we think. And a lot of people over there I found were a lot more relatable than many of my own fellow citizens or community members. So that's something that's been really important for my motivation, and for a lot of other soldiers' motivations in these other countries.
Okay, so we'll do one last question. I think we got one more question from the audience. So what made you get the Hanuman tattoo? Most people love Hanuman, but they don't really think of getting a tattoo. And also, do you mind showing us?
Yeah. So I can't really show you guys. I'm wearing a long sleeve and it's up here.
Okay, that's fine.
What I did, so my Hanuman tattoo actually, right? So it's a Southeast Asian form of it, right? And the difference being, so India kind of lost its tattoo culture, right, over the last millennia or so, through influence from Judeo-Abrahamic traditions, etc., right, like Islam, colonialism, etc. But a lot of the tattoo traditions of Southeast Asia survived from long ago. And an example I was saying earlier was Muay Thai, right? Muay Thai fighters, they pray to Hanuman before a match, and then they usually have he's tattooed on their bodies. So I went with the Southeast Asian form because it was closest more to like a lot of the older depictions of Hanuman, rather than a lot of the ones that we see in art, which kind of come from last 100, 200 years of kind of contemporary art. And then another thing is the Southeast Asian depiction of Hanuman, right, is a little fiercer. So for those of you who've seen the tattoo, he's got fangs. He's burying his mouth. It's a more fearsome depiction, right? And for me, right, the reasons I got it was, I just wanted to get a tattoo, right? I was 18, 19 at the time when I got it. I'm like, man, tattoos are pretty cool. I want to get a tattoo, right? And then, the values that Hanuman ultimately, represents at the time for me, particularly physical fitness and strength, right? During that time, right before I got into college, and started the process of commissioning as an officer, I'd come through a very physically hard time. I'd had a couple knee surgeries on the same knee, and then right before that, for a very long time, I was very overweight. And so at the time, kind of pushing through all that, pushing past the injury, obesity, now that aspect of my life was very important to me because it allowed me to get back on the right mindset to build my discipline and to ultimately have a career in my field right now. So the one, Hanuman was someone that I really looked up to and wanted to embody at that time in my life.
Great. All right, so I think we're reaching the end now of our event today with that. So I just want to say thank you again, Sushruth, for joining us and giving us a great talk and discussion on Hanuman as a warrior. I think we all learned a lot of things, definitely, and how we can try to be more like Hanuman in our day-to-day lives. So before we leave, I just want to mention our social medias real quick so that you guys can follow our future events that we conduct at George Mason. So on Instagram, I think we'll put in the chat. Instagram is just GMU Hindu YUVA, and Facebook Hindu YUVA GMU. So yeah, it's Neha put in the chat. So definitely check us out, and you can follow us for all our future events. Before we leave, right, last thing, I just want to talk about the next Ramnavami event, which is happening tomorrow by Rutgers University, and they'll be having Ram Bhajans performed, so you can register for that one as well. So let me put up their flyer. So yeah, you can register there at that link to continue the Ramnavami series. But yeah, with that, Dhanyawad everyone, and Shubhratri.